It'd be really good to get your view on, where Scholarpack came from. What was it, the thing that because obviously it was a quite dominated market by one single supplier at one point, especially when you came into the market. So you must have had an idea about tackling a segment, or maybe tackling, an area of the market that you thought was underserved,
I would say.
Underserved, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. So I think there's probably a generic understanding as well, as that, Scholarpack is probably more for the sort of smaller primary schools, and it'd be good to get your view on that as well. So why don't you just give us a bit of a background on Scholarpack, where you came from, why you decided to sort of try and break into this market?
Yes, thank you, Nick. Thanks for having me. Looking back now, you'd be pretty crazy to get into the market 10 years ago. Not kind of a consumer market like a Twitter or a TikTok or something like that, where you can blow up quickly with consumers, adopting the product at a fast rate. But we really thought it was worth having a look at this market because, as you say, schools were particularly underserved by an incumbent supplier. So the sort of 2-minute history is we started in 2010, 2011-ish in a small shed in east coast of Lincolnshire. A small town you won't have heard of called Hogsthorpe. Actually, not many people in Lincolnshire have heard of it, actually. It was really warm in the summer and really cold in the winter. That was kind of how the shed worked. My co-founder was a teacher, actually. He had worked on the project part-time for a few years before that. And I came on board to kind of commercialise and scale the company, basically. It kind of came down to this. We thought primary schools could be better served by a cloud-based product that focused specifically on their needs.
Yeah.
If you think about it, MIS is still quite an uncovered area in EdTech. It's kind of a back office function, but it's a fundamental platform that all schools use. And our idea was cutting that information up into a more useful format for schools. Things like spotting attendance pattern for a child, or safeguarding concerns, facilitating communication between parents and schools. And we thought we could make a difference in that area that Sims wasn't doing a very good job of. So we spent 2 years building the initial platform, getting our first English primary school, which I can still remember is Castle Carrick in Cumbria, in the northeastern part of Cumbria. Beautiful area if you haven't been up there. Yeah. Within 3 years, we were serving 50% of primary schools in Cumbria. And these days, 7-8 years later, we're nearly 80-90% of schools in the Lake District. So that shows you how quickly good ideas can spread when you have customers advocating for it. Anyway, back to we scaled up from there a few office moves later. Now we're a team of 45, 50 people in Lincoln, in 80 or so local authority areas. So that's kind of, the background. I'm still here, still aiming for change in the market. Yeah.
Plugging away. It's interesting. I agree with you about the advocacy piece as well, and I think you've done that really, really well. So I always say when I speak to most people around, sort of when we talk about product management, advocacy has to be one of the strongest marketing tools that you can ever have.
Absolutely.
And which means you need to serve those people really, really well, because otherwise people won't talk about it. And that in some ways is indicative of how successful you've been, in the fact that basically you obviously have served some of your customers really, really well to get them to talk about it.
I would put it down to this. Maybe it's I don't know if it's an unconventional view or not. I don't think marketing works in education. I think you can put stuff in front of schools. Sorry, that's the dog walker, Nick.
Okay.
Give me 1 minute.
Okay.
Sorry, door was open. Let me restart that bit. Where was I? So, your question was... Marketing doesn't work, yeah. So, might be an unconventional view, but I tend to think marketing doesn't really work in the education sector. You can put stuff in front of schools. You can send them emails. You can cold call them. You can, host user groups and so on. What it really comes down to is if schools believe in your product, if it's made a difference to their school, they will advocate it to local schools around them. And it's kind of as simple as that. You've got to do a good job. You've got to provide a good service. You've got to have a strong reputation, because schools don't want to buy from companies that don't feel serve the sector well. So there's been many people that have fallen down on that front, not in MIS, in general, I mean. And you see new companies coming into the EdTech and they don't really understand that. You know, that marketing, you can't put 50% of your costs based into marketing and expect to blow up like a consumer product. It comes down to, you know, delivering a solid product and growing out in these kind of small areas.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I think, you know, most, you know, when people start sending out the sort of mail shots and stuff like that, you know, it just doesn't work. You know, people can rip it up and they don't want to look. I think education is one of those markets where they don't want to be sold to. Well,
they're so busy, right? I don't know any no head teachers in my family, but I'm married to a education psychologist. She goes into schools all the time, and the thing that my wife always says is head teachers have no time for technology. You know, they're busy running a school. There's always an issue with a child coming in and, you know, ill that day, safeguarding problems. We don't have time to look at marketing material, and you've got to understand that as a provider to education, and what are you doing to help them, and that's what will sell your product.
So you know, then which means that you have to put a lot of effort in, almost face to face, or through, you know, through advocates, I guess, to actually really understand the value of what you're delivering. Because obviously, you know, you need to get that message out about, you know, why somebody should use your system rather than Sim, say, or another system. You know, if it's doing what they need in the sense of as far as they're aware, then in some ways it must be hard then to sell into some of those schools unless you've got these advocates.
Well, you take a consultative approach to selling. You know, hard selling is just it doesn't work. You've hit the nail on the head with Sims. I think might be doing the job, but could it be doing more? You know, what we try to press for is 30 minutes of your time to kind of demonstrate what you may be doing at the moment, your kind of existing processes, how they could be improved, and what you may be able to do on top of what you're doing at the moment. With Scholarpack particularly, our sort of fundamental belief is that primary schools have a different set of requirements to secondary schools. So I watched one of your other videos, and you asked people around, what's your kind of strategic plan? Well, I can give you ours in a nutshell. We're doubling down on primary schools. We think that every pound invested in a primary school MIS has to be more valuable than in a mixed phase MIS for primary schools. They have different sets of needs. And we think that kind of carries across all of the modules. Clubs, payments, taking your register, it's different in primary school. Fire list is different. Managing meals is different. So if you can specifically solve those needs in primary schools, large and small, because we serve 2 form entry up to 1,000 pupils plus. If we can solve that, that's where we think our growth is going to come from.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point. I think it's a little bit like communication, isn't it? You know, people will communication companies will turn around and say, well, every school needs communication or needs some form of parental communication. But actually, a big chunk of communication that happens in primary school will be at the school gate. You know, they don't necessarily need actually every, you know, a whizzy communication tool. They may need something for SMS when school closes and so on like that, or maybe email these days, but or an app. But ultimately, it's not the same. Every requirement, there is a slight difference, and you need to understand that for sure.
Well, I'll give you an example with an app. We're just about to scale up our app that we've been developing for the last 6 months, and the core feature in that is kind of a chat facility with a parent. Now, in a secondary school, a lot of that communication often will go through the child, especially at the upper year groups, sixth form and so on. Don't tend to send letters home. It's kind of more responsibility of the child. Whereas at primary school, you need that communication to ensure a good education. And that early years period is kind of fundamental. That compounds over a long period of time. If you don't have a good and open communication with the parents around where a child is today, they haven't turned up, for example, you've got to have that communication really quickly.
Yeah, it's a much bigger safeguarding issue.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure you can remember too, in secondary school, you might not have turned up for every lesson. I certainly didn't when we got to the upper end of it, and school didn't know where I was, parents didn't know that's fine. But when you're 5 or 6 years old, that's completely different, and we think a different approach is necessary.
Cool, excellent. So you spoke about sort of some of the stuff you're thinking about going forward. What's your strategic direction, doubling down on primaries? So where do you see this market going? Do you see yourself ultimately being the primary supplier? Where would you see that happening? Is it 3 years, 5 years?
We would like to be the primary supplier. And obviously primary schools are the largest part of the market. We've got 16,000 schools left to go. You mentioned there's a perception that we supply smaller primary schools. If you actually look at the census data, that's not actually that true. We serve plenty of primary schools, over 1,000 kids in Enfield and London. Our average pupil count is roughly the same as other suppliers. So I think people have that perception because we serve primary schools. But there's a great difference between Castle, Carrick and Cumbria with their 1 form entry and someone in Enfield with their 4 form entry. They have different requirements, but fundamentally the product suits all of their needs. So yeah, we supply all ranges. In terms of the market going forward and how that might look in 2 or 3 years, well, it kind of all comes down to cloud versus non-cloud. I think that's almost a hygiene factor in a way. Schools now, just if they're going to move, they expect a cloud-based product, but the sale of SIMs is going to have a huge impact on the market because of the sort of long-standing condition that the market's been in, and this situation with support teams, which we can talk about. For Scholarpack, our biggest sort of challenge is standing still. We've got to keep moving forward. I totally agree with what James was saying in terms of it's good for consumers when they have choice. We aim to give consumers choice, and we want to be the best products for primary schools. Bromcom, Arbor, Pupil Asset may be the best product for secondary schools. That's fine. Schools, the whole market will be served by better choice.
Well, I think it's true about any form of competition and creates an element of innovation. You don't want a stagnant market where there is actually one supplier that everyone just goes to and that's it, done. Because then it's their choice about when they bring in new solutions, or you can become quite complacent. Ultimately,
yes. You could boil it down to monopolies don't tend to police themselves.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But in which case, then you've named some of the other MIS suppliers. So where do you see your competition coming from?
Well, we serve quite a interesting part of the market. We predominantly win local authority maintained schools and small to medium primary maths, because they tend to be the customers which see the value in a primary specific problem, a primary specific system. In terms of competition, at that end, well, all the cloud-based suppliers are competitive. Pupil Asset are doing a good job in Norfolk. There's an example of how quickly a cloud-based MIS can spread. Sims used to supply the whole of Norfolk. They've done a good job there. Arbor and Bromcom are doing really well in the maths market. They tend to be more secondary heavy. So if you look at the stats of the top 20 maths, the maths over 20 schools, 50% of them have already switched from Sims. So if you consider them as the thought leaders in the market, sort of they're the schools which are going to inspire other maths to change. If that trickles down, they're going to find success in the math market. So there's competition. Go on.
No, go on. Sorry.
I was going to say there's competition from each part of those in each part of those markets, but we think a primary MIS has great value to customers that want that for their needs.
Okay. And what about, so you talked about these big mats. There's also analysis that we've done recently where lots of the big mats, when they consolidate, they almost go to one solution across all phases. Does it worry you, or do you just see that as part of the mix of the market in some ways?
Yeah, we see it as part of the mix of the market. I can understand why a United Learning with their 30 or 24 secondary schools would want one system. Makes sense, right? You have a data controller, you have a CTO. They're very kind of they're very business savvy, business focused, and they kind of want all their data in one place. Fine. There is a totally different section of the market which want to do the best thing for their primary schools. That they want to give their primary schools the product which is going to work for them on a day-to-day basis, and the schools they almost put the needs of the schools before the needs of the centralised team.
Yeah,
and that's over half the market. 70% of primary schools are still under maintained control.
Yep. No, absolutely. So I think you're absolutely right. I think when it comes to local support teams and the sort of the maintain market, which will, with the recent announcements, I think it's still going to shrink. I think there's going to be much more academisation. I think there's going to be a push from government to go towards more academisation. I don't think it's ever going to stop, to be honest with you. So if you looked at the maintain sector, so you've done really well in sort of, like you said, in Cumbria. You had some strong advocates that came from the local authority, in fact, and basically started pushing Scholarpack. There are. So do you see that will continue? Do you see that basically you'll deal more with some of the support teams and sort of try and build those sort of relationships? Because there's massive positives with the support teams. And that is, rather than you having to support 22,000 schools, if you ever got there, ultimately, you have these 140 or 160 odd support teams that might be around at the moment. Obviously, I think that's going to shrink. That's another matter altogether. But, do you see it becoming more and more important with these support teams?
Absolutely. The support teams are in an interesting position with the capital sale, because their position is a bit precipitous in some ways. What's their team going to look like in 2 or 3 years' time? That's difficult for them to envisage, I think, at the moment. We've always pushed for partnerships with local authorities. We're always speaking to SIM support teams. They shouldn't really be called SIM support teams. They should be called MIS support teams, but a historical thing, right?
I think they're moving.
They're moving slowly, yeah. So, we've got about 10 support teams that currently deliver first-line support for Scholarpack, and we've already kind of taken the decision to diversify. Places like North Yorkshire and Norfolk and Telford and Nottinghamshire. So we fully expect to see more of those in the next year or two. The role support teams play in the market is, we don't think that needs to change particularly. They have a local relationship with their schools, a tight relationship they've had for many years. That can be really good. They know the specifics of the area, they know the sort of regional things they may need to deal with on census or statutory returns. So there's great value in having local support. We can't deliver that from a central place. So we are more than happy to engage with those teams.
And do you think that they're going to be the size that, because at the moment there's, like I say, about 160 or 140 plus, so I personally have a feeling that it's going to reduce slightly. You're going to see some of the at arm's length sort of teams become bigger. You already have it like with Osmis, and you have it with, SCOMIS and those sort of types of support teams. Do you see it just continue to, so there'll be fewer of them in the long term, maybe more commercially focused?
Yeah, it's like any market really. When you have a period of upending that's been in place for a long time, many people have just got used to the status quo, right? I'm a small support team. I support 50 schools. I've got 5 people. Well, that business model might not work anymore. A lot of teams are going to have to diversify if they want to continue to exist. And the economies of scale with that problem. The big support teams are a much better place to have wraparound services like general IT support and so on, like SCOMIS or North Yorkshire, who've done a great job in kind of being on the front foot with this. So I think you're right. Yeah, there's how many LA support teams are there? Something like 100-ish plus private companies. I think that's probably going to shrink to 50 or so.
Yeah, I think, in fact, I could see it go down further in the long term. I think it's interesting. So we can go back to the sort of the SIM cell, really. I think one of the impacts will be that relationship will change. So in some ways, the protectionism, I think, between the two, from SIMs to the local support and the other way around might diminish slightly. And I think everyone will be a bit more independent in the approach they take.
It was really interesting on we've done a good amount of surveying of our LA partners and potential LA partners, and they reported from the news about the Capita sale that they received. I think it was a conference call that the kind of Capita did with them. They all took away slightly different information.
Yeah.
Some of them thought, no change, not going to affect me, all fine. Some of them thought, okay, we've got to start thinking about this now. So there's a whole range of possibilities that people are considering. I don't think no change is an option personally, if I'm in a support team.
Yeah, well, there's going to be change. Whoever buys Sims, unfortunately, one way or another. No, fortunately, actually, I think it. So I think it's a positive, in my view.
It's going to be great for the market. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I want to take the very bullish case for cloud challenges, which may or may not transpire, we hope it does. You could make a really strong case. The argument, the market's at an inflection point at the moment. I've been doing this for 10 years, and the next 2 years are going to be the biggest change we've seen. A new owner of Sims has got a huge job to do. Got to get schools to the cloud. Got to migrate their data, and that's not easy. In a way, Bromcom, Arbor, Scholarpack, and so on, we're the mature cloud suppliers now.
Well, it comes back to advocacy, doesn't it? You've got referenceability and advocacy. You can actually say, we support X number of schools already, and here's, if you want to talk to them and listen to them and see what their thoughts are on what we deliver, then you can. Where actually there isn't much of that advocacy or referenceability really with the Sims 8 product.
Yeah, well, it depends if the Sims 8 product remains in its current form. I don't know, let's not say too much about that, but a new owner could bring in their own thing, could be US, could be Australian. It's all good for the market, right? Competition is good.
Yeah.
You could have a situation like Nokia, 2007. We look unbeatable. We've got 90% of the smartphone market. Okay, 5 years later, I've got 10%. It could blow up, like that. I'm not saying it will. I think it'll be slower than that. But
and I'd argue that actually the buying will change. Do you know? I would have definitely seen that if Capita kept hold of it. Mainly because I think Capita had almost lost, not necessarily lost interest. That's the wrong thing, but didn't know which direction it needed to go in with the actual product, or even with its own customer base. They're making decisions about understanding the market.
Yeah,
but is my personal view before anyone gets litigated. But ultimately, I think a new buyer will come in with new impetus. So I think actually you're right. I think it will come in with there'll be a much better competition with in the fact that basically I think Sims will be reinvigorated.
Yeah, whichever way they go with it, it'll be a new product. So they will have to convince schools to move from Sim 7 just as much as cloud challengers do.